Who runs the government when Congress can't agree? That's not a theoretical question anymore. In 2026, we found out. Congress failed to pass a funding bill. Partisan deadlock. No compromise. The federal government partially shut down. But something different happened this time. The president didn't just wait. Using emergency powers and statutory fund reallocation, the executive branch kept certain operations running. Not all of them, but enough to advance key policy goals without new congressional approval. This raises a fundamental question about American governance. When the legislative branch is blocked, how far can executive authority reach on its own? And what does that shift mean for the balance of power in Washington? Here's what happened, why it matters, and what changes going forward. The shutdown itself wasn't surprising. Budget fights have become routine. What was different was the response. Congress couldn't agree on spending levels. One party wanted increased domestic funding, the other demanded cuts and policy riders. Neither side had enough votes to break the stalemate. So funding lapsed, federal workers were furloughed, services stopped. Previous shutdowns followed a predictable pattern. Both sides would negotiate, public pressure would build, eventually someone would blink, government would reopen. This time the president invoked emergency declaration authority. The legal basis was the National Emergencies Act, which allows the executive to access certain standby powers during a crisis. The administration argued that a prolonged shutdown threatened essential government functions and national security. Emergency powers let the president redirect funds already appropriated by Congress. Not unlimited funds, but enough to keep specific programs operational. Defense operations continued. Border security funding flowed. Infrastructure projects stayed active. The administration also used existing statutory authorities to reallocate money within departments. These are laws Congress passed years ago that give agencies flexibility to move funds between accounts during fiscal emergencies. This is where the deeper shift begins. The Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse. That means Congress decides how money gets spent. That's the foundational check on executive power. But when Congress deadlocks, that check weakens. The president can't create new money. That would clearly violate constitutional limits. But existing statutes give the executive branch more room to maneuver than most people realize. Emergency declarations have been used before, mostly for disasters or foreign policy crises. Using them to work around congressional gridlock is different. It turns a tool designed for short-term emergencies into a mechanism for advancing policy when the legislature won't act. The legal argument goes like this. Congress already appropriated the money. The president is just deciding how to use it within existing legal frameworks. No new spending, just reallocation. Critics see it differently. They argue this undermines congressional authority. Even if the money was previously appropriated, Congress intended it for specific purposes. Moving it circumvents legislative intent. What matters here is not just the decision, but who now has the final word. The shift is subtle but significant. When Congress functions, it controls spending through the normal appropriations process. The president proposes a budget. Congress negotiates. A bill passes. Money flows according to congressional priorities. When Congress deadlocks, that process breaks down. The president gains leverage. Emergency powers and reallocation authorities become tools to keep government running and advance priorities without new legislative approval. This changes the negotiating dynamic. In past shutdowns, both sides knew the president needed Congress to reopen government. That gave Congress leverage. Now the president can keep key operations running independently. The real shift is in who feels pressure first. If the president can maintain critical functions without Congress, the shutdown becomes less painful for the executive branch. Congress faces public blame for dysfunction, while the president demonstrates action. Executive authority expands when legislative authority contracts. This isn't new. It's been happening gradually for decades across different administrations. But this shutdown accelerates the pattern. Future presidents will remember this precedent. When facing congressional gridlock, they'll know emergency declarations and fund reallocation are viable options. Not unlimited options, but meaningful ones. From a constitutional standpoint, this may matter more than it first appears. The founders designed a system where ambition would check ambition. Congress would guard its spending power jealously. The president would resist congressional overreach. Courts would referee disputes. That system assumes institutions will fight to preserve their authority. When Congress can't pass legislation due to internal divisions, its ability to check the executive weakens. The courts could intervene. Congress or affected parties could challenge the emergency declaration in court. Judges would then decide whether the president exceeded statutory authority. But courts generally defer to presidential claims of emergency. The legal standard is whether the president had a reasonable basis for the declaration, not whether judges agree with the policy. That's a deferential test. Congress could also pass legislation to terminate the emergency. The National Emergencies Act allows Congress to end any emergency declaration through a joint resolution, but that requires both chambers to agree and overcome a presidential veto. If Congress can't pass a budget, it's unlikely to muster the votes to override a veto on emergency termination. The very divisions that cause the shutdown prevent Congress from reclaiming its authority. This creates a cycle. Congressional dysfunction enables executive action. Executive action reduces pressure on Congress to compromise. Less compromise means more dysfunction. So, what does this mean long term? Future administrations will study this shutdown closely. They'll see what worked, which statutory authorities provided the most flexibility, how courts and the public responded, what political costs emerged. If the political costs are manageable, this becomes a template. Not for every budget fight, but for situations where a president decides congressional inaction justifies executive intervention. The precedent extends beyond shutdowns. If emergency powers can substitute for congressional appropriations during a funding lapse, what about other forms of gridlock? Could a president declare emergencies to advance climate policy, immigration enforcement, infrastructure development? Each use of emergency authority creates a new baseline. What seems extraordinary today becomes normal tomorrow. Presidents of both parties have expanded executive power when they had the chance. This pattern is bipartisan and decades old. Congress could push back. It could reform the National Emergencies Act to narrow presidential discretion. It could tighten fund transfer authorities. It could pass more restrictive appropriations language. But reform requires Congress to act collectively. That's difficult in an era of narrow majorities and deep partisan divisions. Individual members might oppose executive overreach in principle, but support it when their party controls the presidency. The result is asymmetric. Executive power expands quickly during crises. It contracts slowly, if at all. Each administration inherits the authorities claimed by its predecessors and adds new ones. States might also respond. If they disagree with how federal funds are being reallocated, they could bring legal challenges. States have standing to sue when federal actions affect them directly. These cases would test the boundaries of emergency authority in federal court. Different circuit courts might rule differently, creating splits that could reach the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court would then decide fundamental questions. How much deference do courts owe presidential emergency determinations? Can Congress meaningfully limit these powers through legislation? What counts as a genuine emergency versus a policy dispute? If this pattern continues, the balance of authority could look very different in just a few years. Consider what has changed already. Presidential use of executive orders has increased. Agency rulemaking has become more aggressive. Emergency declarations have multiplied. All of this happens without new legislation. The 2026 shutdown adds another tool to the executive toolkit, the ability to maintain government operations and advance policy priorities even when Congress is deadlocked. This doesn't make the president a king. Congress still controls new appropriations. Courts still review executive actions. Elections still provide accountability. But it does shift the center of gravity. More decisions get made by the executive branch. Fewer require congressional approval. The system becomes less legislative and more administrative. Whether that's good or bad depends on your perspective. If you trust the current president, you might welcome decisive action. If you don't, you might fear unchecked power. But the structure matters more than any single administration. Powers claimed by one president become available to all future presidents. Emergency authorities invoked today set precedents that last for decades. So we return to the opening question. Who runs the government when Congress can't agree? The 2026 shutdown suggests an answer. When Congress deadlocks, the president moves forward using existing authorities, not without limits, not without controversy, but more independently than before. This may not dominate the headlines. It's not as dramatic as a constitutional crisis, but shifts like this quietly redefine how power moves in America. The balance between branches changes not through revolution, but through precedent. Each shutdown, each emergency declaration, each fund reallocation adjusts the baseline. Over time, these adjustments compound. What looked like a temporary response to gridlock becomes a permanent feature of governance. And that matters because it determines who decides when the system is stuck, not just in this shutdown, but in every future confrontation where Congress cannot act and the president claims authority to move forward alone.